Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Power Man Podcast. My name is Rory Paquette, and I am, as always, your very grateful host. You guys all know that. I could not be more grateful for what you folks have been doing lately. When we made the move to 5 times a week, I've got to admit, I was like, hey, is this too much Rory for everybody? I don't know. But you folks have come through, and we've just skyrocketed. I appreciate you so very much. If you're not out there doing what you're doing, liking, sharing, subscribing, doing everything that you're doing, I don't get to sit here and do what I'm doing. So I thank you from the bottom of my heart. And I hope that one of the reasons that you're doing all that is because we bring on these awesome guests like the gentleman we have here today. We're going to get to that in just a minute. You folks all know that before we get going, we have something we've got to do. That's right. We got to pay a couple of bills. So let me take a quick sip of my preferred beverage. I need one more of those. It's been a long morning already. Oh man, that's good stuff. And you guys all know what we're drinking. That's right. It's Freedom Hill Coffee at Freedom Hill Coffee on Instagram. Go check them out. Deep, dark, rich, bold, and beautiful. Just like my wife. They brew a mean cup of joe. It is fantastic. They do all the right things for all the right reasons, and they support veterans, which you all know is incredibly important to us here at Power Man. And so we support them. Look them up on Instagram, Freedom Hill Coffee, at Freedom Hill Coffee. Go check them out and tell them Power of Man sent you. You will not be sorry. Let me get one more sip because I don't know if I can keep up with this guy in front of me. All right, we'll be drinking that throughout the episode. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everyone. And thank you to our guest today for coming in here. I can't wait to hear his story, hear about his program, his books, and everything else. But this gentleman's got a backstory that I think is gonna really hit home with a lot of you folks. I know a lot of us are struggling with a lot of different issues. This gentleman has been through it. He's got family members that have been through it, and I think he's going to show quite a few of us the way to maybe start lifting our heads up again. So please welcome to the podcast, founder and executive director of STEPS, dedicated to helping people live life better, Steve Ward. Steve, how you doing, sir?
I'm doing great, Roy. Thank you so much. I like the IU plug there. Y'all had a good run this year. Congratulations.
The IU cup is almost famous on this podcast. It's
Yeah, yeah,
I have like 40 other coffee cups, but this is the only one I'm allowed to use because people actually message in and go, "What happened to the cup? What did you
yeah.
do?"
There you go.
It's
There you
crazy.
go.
But Steve, thank you so much for coming on here today. You and I had a really nice talk in the pre-interview. You told me a lot about yourself. Tell our audience, who is Steve Ward? What are you about, and why are you here?
It's a good question, especially in the context of this audience. I think it's relevant that I am a son and I'm also a dad. So I think the way that we are brought up spheres some of the way that we go through life. So there's pertinence there, but we had a lot of experiences with my son growing up. And now the most incredible thing is that my son is now a dad himself. So I can see the role of being a father through different lenses. And as you hinted at, our journey at times wasn't always easy. We had a lot of substance abuse and even mental health issues in my family, and that is a tornado that goes through a family when it does. But as God is often good at doing, He can use some of our toughest challenges to do His best work. So it was a long road to get here, but we learned a lot along the way.
I'm glad to
So,
hear that, and congratulations on being a grandfather. That's just
well,
absolutely
thank you
fantastic.
very much. I
Absolutely
mean, we,
fantastic.
we're so excited, and I know other grandparents may think this is the case, but we really do have the best grandchild in the world. I think that's true.
I'm going to let you hold on to that moniker for a little while, only because I
Yeah.
don't have any yet.
Okay.
All right, and
Okay. All
and then
right.
you
All
then you're
right.
off the pedestal. So I've got three kids that are all in childbearing age, and one just got
There you
married,
go.
and the other two are both getting married to their significant others in October of this year. So
Oh,
by no
congratulations.
by November or December, I'm like, news. What? Anybody? Come on, what's going on? So
Yeah,
they're already like they see me call and they go, Dad, no news yet. Leave me alone.
yeah, yeah. So we'll let you know.
Right. But that's fantastic. And now you mentioned you and your family and so on. I'm not sure if it's unique in that or if that's more commonplace for it to like kind of pass through a family and generations like that. Maybe you can shed some light on that.
Couple of things. One is to pass from generation to generation is not at all unique. In fact, if someone's parent has abused substances, there's a 50% higher chance that it will pass on to the next generation. There's a lot of behavioral reasons why that's the case. They haven't isolated what you would call technically a genetic reason for that, but it certainly is the case
I
that
see.
it tends to flow through families. Um, and the other aspect I may mention is when there's substance abuse or related issues going on in a family, it affects everyone in the family. It's not just an individual's disease or situation, it affects everybody.
Sure. Sure. I have quite a bit of experience with that myself, that everybody who's a listener has heard, but not for me, but with my father. And so he was
Yeah.
one who had those types of issues. My brother and
Yeah.
I are both fortunate that neither of us have encountered that, but I think it was probably just because it was so bad
Yeah.
with our father that, we went a direction of saying never, 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 type of
Yeah.
deal. But now, with you and with your situation, did this start with you, and what happened there?
Well, um, in retrospect, my father was an alcoholic. He wasn't probably in the genre that you described yours, but in retrospect, I could see that he was. He was what you would call a high functioning alcoholic, right? I mean, he was very successful at what he did, but he had grown, I think, to depend on it as a way to deal with the stress of work, et cetera, which I became very familiar with later. So growing up, I'm sure it affected me to a moderate degree, but he was in generally a good dad, right? I mean,
Good.
he loved us, I think. Um, the only thing I wish is that we had more of a relationship. You know,
Hmm.
he was brought up in a generation where men worked and they supported their families, and that defined them. So that's what he did. I mean, he worked. Later in his life, he wound up coming down with lung cancer, which ultimately killed him. And I remember one time I had to drive him. He wanted me to drive him to work, and I picked him up at chemotherapy to drive him to work. If you know
Wow.
anybody who's gone through chemotherapy, you know what that does to you. But I'm just saying that's how he was wired. Now, the byproduct of that is when you have someone who's focused on work or even a workaholic, that has ramifications to their family, So I wish we'd been closer. I wish we'd had more of a relationship. You know, there's one anecdotal story I remember that kind of exemplifies that. That I was playing Little League one time when I was 9, and I know that I was 9 because of the particular team that I was on. And my mom and dad decided to come to the game, and they hadn't really come to my games before. And so they're sitting there, and afterwards, my dad said, "Well, see, I didn't know you could play baseball like that." And I'm quite a number of years past 9 right now. But not only can I remember what I was thinking, I can feel it. I was thinking, it's because you never come to my damn games. It, and so it's not like being at a little league game defines being a good dad. That's not my point. But being there, being present, and having a relationship is a big part of it. And I wish more than anything we'd had a deeper, more sustained relationship. Again, there was no trauma, nothing wrong, just more distant than it could have been.
Sure. Now, how did that impact your relationship then with your son?
I think I swung the other way. I was very, very committed to being an intentional, good parent as much as I could. Now, when I was in recovery, I found out some things like most people do is that we're all addicted to something, right? And generally, we're addicted to multiple things. So I found out that alcohol was not my only addiction, that I was also addicted to things like control, performance, and perfectionism,
Hmm.
right? So when you go to the kind of an engineering school like I did, and when you work in business for 38 years like I did, those things are rewarded in the real life,
Right.
but in terms of our emotional well-being and how we interact with others, they have downsides, So I was very intentional, but in retrospect, I wish I'd have chilled out a little bit more with my son. I think all parents are codependent to some degree, and our marriage followed the typical model where I leaned a little bit toward the controlling side and my wife leaned a little bit toward the enabling side. So the way that showed up for me is I wasn't mean to him, but I was very proactive in teaching and lecturing and talking to him and setting boundaries. And I wish sometimes I'd just slowed down a little bit and just tried to be in his world a little more. So I think the good news is my experience with my dad made me desperately long to have close relationships with both my sons. We have another son as well. You know, perhaps at times to the degree that I overdid it a little bit, but it was all at least with the right spirit in mind. So,
I'm feeling every word you're saying right now.
yeah,
In
yeah,
a very strong way, I had the same sort of issue with my older son, and it
yeah,
was one of those where I wanted him to be just have every opportunity. I wanted him to be perfect, and so there were times when I was almost demanding perfection, especially in sports and things.
yeah,
And really, it wasn't about being perfect. It was just I wanted so much for him. I wanted to
yeah,
have so many
yeah,
opportunities that I felt like I was right.
yeah,
And somewhere along the way, you catch yourself, or someone points it out, and then you start to go, "Wow, what am I doing?" You know,
yeah.
what was what was your wake up? I mean, what made you start to look at yourself and say, "Hey, maybe I shouldn't be controlling and working towards perfectionism and things like that"? Was there something that happened?
And with the big steps for me, when I look back on my life, there are three sequences of things I think that put me on a road that led me where I am now. One was I found God or God found me at a relatively late age. I was 39 or 40, right?
Wow.
So
Yeah.
that changed my perspective on everything. Prior to that, I got married, having kids, and before having getting married, having kids, I was a pretty nice guy, right? If you'd have met me, you said, "Oh, he's a pretty nice guy." But like most of us, I was thinking mostly about me, right? I was living a life to have the most fun and excitement and make the most money and do the best in my career. Everything was focused on me. And getting married opened the aperture to say, well, I'll be darned. I can actually care about someone more than myself. That was eye-opening. And I think maybe God needed me to go through that before he showed up. So, but accepting, Jesus as my savior and changed the whole orientation of my life, the way I thought about things. But then
Hmm.
where it really got practical was in recovery. When for a period of time I was going through recovery for myself and as a dad and as a spouse. Because we were all struggling in different ways. And I learned a lot about how do you live life effectively in recovery.
Hmm. Now you mentioned that there were three things. So the first one was finding God,
I,
finding Jesus, right?
yeah, the second was recovery. And
Recovery.
I guess the third one was probably tied to that is this journey we all go through where those most important values hopefully ultimately become known to us. For me, the first one was relationships or community, that they are important, that I can care for someone other than me. Finding God introduced me to meaning. After that, wanting to get involved in helping people who are hurting, introduced me to the concept of purpose. And it was really in recovery where things like identity and contribution became important. So I guess that was kind of more of a subliminal backstory. The big events, though, I think being God finding me and going through our recovery journey. So,
Interesting. And you unpacked a lot right there. So I wanted to just kind of get, those three out so, we could sort of go back over them. But it's not a small thing, to talk about how you found God and at an older age. What brought that about? How did that happen for you?
well, when I was a kid, our family went to church, but for me, it was kind of boring. I mean, church is, if you're 8 or 10, I sat in a typical Southern church and, tried to work on puzzles or things like that. So nothing negative, but just it wasn't invigorating.
Sure.
As a teenager, I wound up going to a youth group for a while because I found out that cute girls go to youth group.
There you
So,
go.
so as a young adult in college and then later out in the work world, God just wasn't a big part of my life. I wasn't anti-God. I probably thought very well of God when I thought about him, which wasn't very often.
Sure.
And then having kids, my wife and I started thinking about what those things that having families often does, which, I wonder if it makes sense for us to bring our kids up in the church. And that seemed like a reasonable thing to consider. So we started going to church. And I was trained as an engineer, so I'm a very methodical, thoughtful thinker. And I sat there, hearing all these things, and it occurred to me that, wow, if all that stuff is true, that's pretty important. So maybe I ought to investigate it. So I love reading. So I just started reading every book I could find that, books about, is the Bible true? What is God like? And why do people believe in Bible? Who is this guy Jesus? And what evidence is there that he lived and that he died? And I probably read 50 or 60 or 70 books. So I
Mm.
was on what I think of as a search for truth, because I didn't go into that process with a preconceived notion. I think I went into it with an open mind. Just hadn't really thought about God that much before. And the more I studied and the more I thought about it, I used to say to my wife sometimes during this process, I'd say, honey, if all this stuff is really true, you know, if there is a God who created us and he designed this earth for us, and then he came to earth and lived and died for us, if all that's really true, doesn't that change everything? Because it does. It changes everything.
I
You know,
love that.
it changes everything. So I got to the point where intellectually I was convinced it was all true. But I think I still needed a heart change. So at that time, we moved from Atlanta down to Orlando, and we tried going to a church that didn't work for us. And on a whim, which I don't think was a whim, we swung into another church that we were driving by every Sunday. And I met a group of people that I just connected with. They were fun to be around, they were successful, and they were very sincere, transparent Christians. And so a few months into going to that church, they did something which scared me to death. Now, this will date how old I am. I don't even know how much you're going to know, but they invited me to something called a Promise Keepers event, which back in the day, probably before your day, this group called Promise Keepers used to fill football stadiums, And
Oh
so we
yeah.
lived in Orlando. So I said yes. And then I started thinking, man, what am I in for? You know, yeah, I didn't know what this was going to be like. But anyway, about 40 people from our church got in cars and drove up to Jacksonville. We went to Jaguar Stadium, and we got there a little bit late on Friday night, so it was dark. And I remember we walked up the back ramp and walked out into the upper deck to a stadium with 70,000 men there, and they were there for one reason. And I think God hit me between the eyes with a 2x4. It was instantly clear to me why I was there.
Yeah.
I could almost see the milestones in my life that had led me to that place. And so it was a very awesome, fun, joyful experience. Um, and then as most people know, right, that starts our journey of change, right? God changes us over a period of time. So in my inevitable wisdom, I I I kept drinking compulsively for a number of years after that. And I had an incredibly clever rationalizations for why that was an okay thing to do. But it was at that point that God had grabbed me, and He wasn't going to let go. I think, and He's still shaping me and correcting my imperfections along the way. You know,
I
so
love the story. Do you mind me asking what was the rationalization?
rationalizations are normally well developed because we think about them a lot,
Right.
right? So I, perhaps like my dad, was what you might refer to as a high functioning alcoholic. And I don't say that to mean I was less than one, just that if you knew me, you wouldn't have known. Probably the only
Right.
person that knew was probably my wife. I was very successful at work. I think I was a pretty good dad and a good husband. I was active in my church, but uh, alcohol had come to be an idol and an addiction to me. In other words,
Hmm.
it was compulsive in how I used it, and it was more in control of me than I was of it. So my rationalizations were things like, well, look, I'm I'm still doing good at work. I'm not affecting work. I think I'm doing good in my family. And look at all these things I'm doing in the church. And I'm not hurting anybody. And I only drink after I get home from work and on the weekends. And I'm only drinking wine. And I won't go into how much I was drinking. But, we build this rationalization like, hey, it's okay. So I was able to put it into this compartment that said, okay, I, yeah, I do that, but the rest of me, I got this knocked, so it was a very effective rationalization for a few years,
Interesting. I love the Promise Keepers reference. I'm definitely old enough to remember Promise Keepers. It was I'm trying to remember the name of the coach that was running the program. It was
McCarthy.
there it was.
Yeah, yeah,
Right.
yeah,
I knew it was a
yeah,
football coach, but I'm like, what
yeah,
was the guy? Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
So no, I remember them. I remember them very, very well.
yeah,
And the fact that that's not as nowhere near as big today as it was back then is a shame.
yeah,
But it also is a
yeah,
result of a lot of other things along the way for another podcast. But
yeah, yeah,
yeah, it's so you have this awakening, uh, an awakening like that does definitely change you because you end up starting to live not just for others but for God as well, instead of just for yourself. And so I know that shift takes place. At what point did you say, "Hey, um, I've been doing this long enough. I need recovery"? What was it that
yeah,
got you to make that move?
yeah. So in the first few years after God found me, it's interesting in retrospect, but I was so active doing things in the church and the community. I don't think I was thinking about the alcohol part very much. I was just like I was in my prideful way. I was pretty convinced that, I'd say, "Hey God, I'll let you work on the rest of the world. I got Orlando in Central Florida. I'm your man there." So I didn't really worry about alcohol that much. But, wanting to understand what the Bible said, so I started reading about it, and the Bible doesn't say don't drink. But
Right.
I mean, Jesus turned water into wine, right? But if you look close enough, you see things like it does tell us not to get drunk and be out of control, and it tells us that our body is a temple and that we should take care of it and that God dwells in it, and it tells us that we shouldn't be a stumbling block for other people, and it tells us that everything we should do should worship and glorify God. So all of a sudden you start putting the clues together and you start going, huh, maybe this is something to think about. Again, by the way, I'm not against people drinking. I go to a Presbyterian church now, and a lot of my best friends, a lot of Christians friends will drink. So it's not a matter of can you drink or not. It's a matter of are you addicted and is it an idol in your life or not? And does
Right.
it cause harm? Which for me it did.
I see.
So two things, well, I guess three things really came to bear. One was my wife was struggling too. And I started thinking, am I being a bad example for the woman that I love? In other words, am I contributing her struggles? Am I being a stumbling block to her?
Right.
Because, the second was, you know, I increasingly, it became clear that God wanted me to stop and that He was saying, Steve, for you in particular, this is an idol in your life. You're using it to deal with life as opposed to using me to deal with life. But the third thing is, I would sit there and I would think about the direction of my life. So now I'm in my mid 40s, right? And I started thinking, so am I going to get to the end of my life and look back and think, well, Steve, you lived a pretty good life, but you wasted so much of your energy trying to get a good buzz. Did I want that to be what defined my life? Was that going to be my legacy? Did I kind of cruise through life at two-quarter speed? And that thought was terrifying to me, you know. So I decided I needed to quit. So I did.
Wow. And so you sought out recovery then at that point.
Yeah.
What happened
Um,
next?
my recovery plan of choice was called Celebrate Recovery, which is a Christian 12-step program. My wife and I quit at the same time. Her recovery plan of choice was AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, which is also a 12-step based program. So for people who aren't familiar with recovery, there are 200 different groups around the world that use the 12 steps as their basis. I mean, millions of people have been experienced to it. And uh, I actually think that it's the world's best life improvement program. It's one of the biggest secrets in the world. So I was in recovery. And by the way, and during part of that time, my son started struggling. And even as early as when he was a junior in high school, we had to take him out of high school and put him into a recovery program. So I'm experiencing recovery in all these different ways. And interestingly, found it fascinating. To me, it wasn't a chore. It wasn't negative. It was fascinating, and within months, I had three epiphanies, I think, which changed the direction. Even back then, it put me on a path that led me to where I am now. The first epiphany was that some of the world's worst problems, and I would suggest substance abuse and mental health issues are in that category. They're not only treatable, they're potentially preventable. In other words, there are millions of people who've recovered from alcohol. They just don't run around talking about it very much, which is
Sure.
their right, right? So our problems are treatable. The second is the way to do that is you live life better. You live life more effectively, mentally, socially, emotionally, personally, and spiritually. And by doing that, we learn to cope with life on its own terms. And we therefore don't need something else. And the third epiphany I saw was when they put the 12 steps up there, I said, well, those look a lot like the Bible to me, which in effect they do, because they're very biblical in their nature. I mean,
Right.
and a lot of people go through AA and they have a higher power that's what they define it to be, but I'll be darned. The 12 steps are talking to them about the God of the Bible, and eventually he'll get through to them. So those three epiphanies that the world's worst problems can be treated. The way we do it is to live life the right way, and that happens to be the way God wants us to and had told us to in the Bible. And I started thinking about a question, and this is what changed my life. I started thinking, why in the world do we wait till people crash and then send them through 2 years of recovery? That makes no sense. My degree is in industrial engineering, right, which is kind of a process oriented. So I'm thinking, why don't we move earlier in the process, right? Where do people learn how to live life effectively?
Right.
Why don't parents raise their kids this way? Why don't we teach real life 101 in high school and college, And the more I studied it, the more I saw that this is true. Most people develop their ways of coping with life by making it up along the way. They have pain, they come up with a strategy to deal with that pain, and they do that behavior over and over again, and that becomes ingrained in who they are, whether they notice it or not. So I always started looking for books that said, how do you live life practically, including embodying a lot of these principles they talk about in recovery? And I didn't find a lot. So that's why I wrote my first book, Steps: A Daily Journey to a Better Life. It's it's a book. It's not really about addiction and recovery. It's about living life effectively, but it utilizes the 12 steps and a lot of the principles, including those that are spiritually based, that they teach you in recovery. So,
Interesting. I'm looking forward to reading it. I apologize that I haven't had a chance to yet, but
yeah,
so in this book that you decided to write, it talks about prevention then. I mean, or is it leading your life in a way that will prevent it without actually
yeah.
saying this is prevention?
It's clear in the book where what my journey led me from, right? That I'm overt in saying we're integrating recovery principles, but guess what? Also principles that are based on psychology and wellness and the Bible and neuroscience, right? But yeah, it's overt up front that it's based on recovery principles, but it's about living life better. I mean, I've now started a nonprofit, right? And our goals are to help people improve their lives, grow closer to God, and prevent addictions and other issues. And I think you do all those things at the same time. You live
Interesting.
life better, you grow closer to God, and by doing so, that will tend to prevent or minimize the problems you're going to face. They won't eliminate them, right? We'll always have problems, but it'll lessen or eliminate those that we cause ourselves.
Sure, sure. I love the way you keep looking at it through the engineer, mentality, looking for
Yeah,
empirical
yeah,
data, and that's also, an engineer mentality, that sort of mathematical. Well, hey, if
yeah,
it keeps breaking down, then let's not just keep fixing it. Let's go back in the thing and find out why it keeps breaking down and fix that. So
yeah.
I love the thought process that goes into it.
One of the smartest guys in the world, right? Einstein is attributed to saying he's the one who said, right, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over
Over
again
and
and
over.
expecting a different result, right? So,
Right. Exactly.
but it's amazing that we all do that. We repeat the same things over and over again and keep getting the same results. Then we go, huh, I wonder why that happened.
Sure. Now you mentioned that you were going through recovery and your wife was going through recovery. I'm assuming that your wife made it through okay too, and that she's doing well.
She did. She
Excellent.
did.
Okay.
Yeah.
Blessing. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
While you're going through that, your son is developing
Yeah.
an issue. So how do you go through recovery for you and focus on all of that, and yet find a way to lead the way for your son to also
Yeah.
start to
Yeah.
recover?
Well, like I said, I think it was a blessing, right? That I started figuring things out. Let me think about this timing. Probably before his problems started, I would say, spiraling out of control, because I was now even hyper vigilant to the things going on. Now, at times I may have been hyper vigilant, similar to what I said before,
Right.
I could have been over vigilant, but all that, but we were very intentional and we had his best interest in mind. And we were very proactive about trying to be the right parent. Did we make mistakes along the way? Yes. I erred toward control. My wife erred toward enabling. But as I think you hinted at a little while ago, most parents really love their kids. We loved our son, right? And but you can be too controlling out of a sense of love,
Right.
right? I was convinced I could teach him or guide him or put the right boundaries on him so that, wow, man, I could fix him, right? My wife loved him so much that she wanted to protect him from pain, right? But when you protect a child or a teenager from pain, in other words, you soften the bad consequences of their negative decisions.
Mhm.
You're crippling them, whether you know it or not. So so maybe I overdid it at times, but we gave it our best shot, you know. But he was a strong-willed young man. He was raised in the church, went to Christian schools, but we moved again when he was going into probably junior high. Moved back to Atlanta, and he went to a school so where the kids there had known each other since kindergarten, and he was looking for a peer group, and he picked a group that was making some bad decisions, and he started
Sure.
going down a path that became very dark at times. So it was ultimately a 10-year journey. But with
Wow.
him, because I was going through recovery, I think it gave me a lot of tools, a lot of knowledge, a lot of what to work for, you know, but probably because it was so fresh to me in my zest, boy, was I eager to impart all my wisdom on him. Yeah.
Sure. So
So,
that, I mean, that's awesome actually that you going through recovery helped you deal with,
yes.
getting your son out. Now, did he go through recovery also,
Yeah.
like officially?
In a lot of different ways. Um, Early on, we tried things like finding people who could be mentors in his life, including people who were coming from a recovery background. We tried counselors. When he was a junior in high school, things got a little out of control. So we started talking to him to say, you're on a path where the only decision we can make would be a relatively drastic one, that you would need to go into a residential program for a while. And his choices led to that path. So as a junior in high school, he went to a program for 6 weeks and came out of that and had a pretty good year and a half or 2 years. In other words, recovery stuck with him to a degree, but he was young and he was strong-willed and he was still sorting himself out. And at that age, you're not really evaluating long-term consequences. And he was a popular guy, so he's hanging around with a lot of people who wanted to do those behaviors that are popular to do, which
Right.
include drinking and smoking and using and et cetera.
Right.
So it slowly evaporated. And a couple of years later, he had graduated high school, and he said, "Well," and we didn't let him go away to college his first semester because it just didn't seem right. But he kept talking to us, saying, "I'm ready. I want to go. I want to go." And there was one time where we're trying to say, should we let him go away to college? And in every fiber of my being, I knew that was a dumb thing to do. I just felt like this isn't going to right. And I would never represent that God talks to me audibly or anything, and he didn't even then. But one of the clearest messages I ever got was I was sitting on my couch in my living room one time, and I felt like Jesus was saying, Steve, you need to let him go. In other words, I got him. You need to let him go to college. So we did. And he crashed and burned
Oh,
big time in the first semester.
sure.
And he went through 6 months that were bad in a lot of different ways. And that led to him going back into a residential recovery program for a year this time. Now, someone who's, you know, poking sticks at Christianity or God may say, well, look, Steve, you prayed for something. You tried to do what you thought he heard and it blew up. I said, it's supposed to happen, Roy. It was supposed to happen.
Yeah.
He was supposed to have that crash. He was supposed to wind up in that recovery program. And now he has come out of it more prepared to live life effectively than any young people. He and I have had this conversation many times, and other people in recovery will get it too. I'll say, I say, you are now the man God designed you to be, not in spite of what you went through, but in many cases because of it.
Yes.
And he gets that. He understands it. He's good with that. And I would say the same is for me and my wife as well. God uses our worst times to do some of his best work. It's really incredible.
Yeah. It's
So
amazing because people still to this day think that if you bring Jesus into your life and you accept God, that what you're doing is you're signing up for like the easy path, like you're hitting an easy button,
yeah,
and oh well, I'm with Jesus now, so I can just sit back and it's all good. And you know, God more than likely put him through what he put him through with his crash because doing it at that point, as opposed to doing it later on down the
yeah,
road, it probably saved him, probably saved someone else,
absolutely.
enabled him to start his life. I
Yeah,
mean, there's a million things you could look at it like that, but people don't
yeah,
get that it's not always in our timing. It's in his.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And this popped into my head this morning. So when something pops into my head, Roy,
Hey, you go
I
for
tend
it.
to do it. Are you okay? He, our son, wrote my wife and I a little card. He got married 3 years ago. So he's now doing well. He's doing great in his job. He's married. Um, and he wrote us a short card on the day he got married. I normally can't get through this, but your audience might think it's pertinent. Said, Mom and Dad, it's been a crazy ride, hasn't it? Sometimes, sometimes it feels good to reflect on the journey. How many young people, quote, reflect on the journey? He says,
Right.
y'all never lost faith in me. Through all of my downs and screw ups, you kept believing me and giving me your unconditional support. I wouldn't be in this position this weekend without it. Y'all made this happen, and I will be forever thankful. Today, your son is getting married and starting a life and family of his own. But I'll never forget what got me here in the first place. I'm honored to be your son, and I love you both immeasurably. So I don't read that to say that my wife and I were good parents because we made a lot of mistakes. And a lot of our parenting ministry is based on mistakes that we made. What I do say is, I think we did two things well. He knew all the time that we loved him. Even when we had to make tough decisions, he knew that. And even when he disagreed with it, he knew that. And the other thing is we hung in there. Sometimes perseverance is what's needed. And if your son or daughter or spouse or friend is going through problems, it may seem like insanity and it may go on and on. And sometimes you have to hang in there and you just have to keep loving them and keep being there for them. But he's doing very well now. So God bless him.
Thank you for sharing that with everybody.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's I don't want to say something like that makes it worth it, but
Yeah.
we simply can't protect our children from everything. We
Yeah.
just can't.
And and really you compare this to, right, in his journey, right, I was the one who erred a little bit toward controlling, right? So I'm kind of the one setting the boundaries and all that. And he was a very strong-willed young man. By the way, for other parents, it's very interesting that the qualities that you think are dangerous qualities when they're young could the converse of that could very well turn out to be a positive later. For example, he now I think he is a he has very good leadership capabilities, but at the age of 17, it came across as a strong will. I want to do things my way. So there is we had our issues, and he was a big guy. I'm not a small guy, but he played baseball and he was 6'4". And there was one time when he really wanted to do something that we didn't think he was supposed to do. And I don't really remember the sequence, but all of a sudden, my 17-year-old is standing up in my face. And I'm thinking, this dude's about to hit me. And I'm laughing now. It wasn't very funny at the time.
Right.
So the point being, we had tumultuous times. And there was one time earlier than that. And by the way, this next one I'll mention hurt me more than that one. There was one time we'd had an argument about something. Again, I was probably in my what I thought was incredible wisdom, trying to show him the way to live his life, and he disagreed with our guidance. And he found a picture of he and I when he was a kid, 6 or something. This picture was one of those cool dad pictures, right? Where he and I are doing something. I'm reading him a book or something. It was a really nice picture. But now he's a teenager, and he found that picture and he cut it in half so that I was on one side, he was on the other. And after this argument, he left those two pieces on my desk for me to find. And he was sending a message, right? He was sending a message like, I don't need you in my life being that way. And I kept those two pieces of that picture in my desk for years as a reminder of how important it is to stay connected, to our sons and daughters. And even when that means us compromising and really trying to pause and get into their world and understand their world, so we went through a lot.
Yeah.
But afterwards, he understood. He understood that everything we'd done had been with his best interest in mind. Even when we made mistakes, he had learned from recovery. It had helped equip him with tools, and he's now better prepared for life than other people. I tell him now, there's a lot of his buddies who look like they have life knocked, right? They're making money, they're successful, everything's looking, and I'll tell them, I say, son, they don't know what they don't know. You know, they're they're living life at a surface level, right? They're
Mhm.
focused on, I want everybody to think I'm doing good at work and that I don't have any problems in my life and look how much money I'm at. That's what they're living. But underneath, they're building a life that's based on anxiety and insecurity and shallow relationships. And they don't know what they don't know, especially if they don't have God in their life. I mean, Henry David Thoreau said most men live lives of quiet desperation.
Desperation. Yeah.
That's very, very true. And a lot of people grow up in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, and that's all they know. And so then when something happens to their job, which probably equals their identity or something like that, they don't know how to cope with life anymore. So I'm a firm believer in recovery and even in the book, right? I would suggest if you take the principles of recovery, move upstream, you can use I like the term pre-covery, right? Which is learn how to live life before the problem happens. You move them up further upstream, and I would use the word discovery. Discover that there are ways that God wants us to live that'll bring us more peace, joy, and purpose and contentment and a sense of identity. And if we do that, guess what? We're going to have better relationships. And we're not going to make some of the stupid decisions we're going to make otherwise. Again, we will have trials in our life, but life can go better.
Sure.
So, yeah,
So the second book, that's a
yeah.
follow-up to the first. What did you want to accomplish with the second book? How is it different?
Good question. When I started STEPS Ministries, right, I felt called to do it, right? So those experiences before and those three epiphanies that said, why do we wait, till people crash and burn? It led me to write a book. And I discovered I liked doing that research and I liked trying to communicate that to people. So I started the blog way back then. It was a hobby. I still had a full-time job at IBM, right? So, but along the way, I felt called to go do something in ministry. And it eventually became starting a nonprofit. Um, And I was trying to think, I want my nonprofit to be something I'm called to. And I think we're all called to things. And that doesn't mean, we're going to get a message saying, I want you to go be a missionary in China, right? I just mean there are things that we are called to do. And it could be a thing or it could be a series of things. And I think God designed us and God allows the experiences we go through in a way that shapes our calling. So I was thinking about ministry. Well, what things should be part of that? And one of them is, well, God allowed me to be in the business world for 38 years. So I wanted to be able to connect with other business people, right? And to connect in a way where, it uses the logic as well as the emotions. It uses the mind and it uses all that. And so the next book, Next Right Steps, is more trying to say, if you're open to spirituality, but you're a logical person, what is a decision making process you can use to make good choices?
Hmm.
Because all of us, even effective business people, right? We very often make choices that are either impulsive, like we do it in the heat of the moment, compulsive, because that's the way we always make those choices, driven by emotions, or random, right? Teenagers make a lot of random decisions, you know, as opposed to being more thoughtful and proactive about them. So
Right.
that's more of a book about making good choices and how do you go about doing it.
Nice.
So
Nice. The STEPS program itself. I mean, we've alluded to it. We've kind of talked around it a little bit, but just briefly, maybe, what exactly is it?
yeah, we're not trying to be a recovery organization.
Okay.
We're not trying to be a church. We're not even trying to be what I would call a coaching organization. We provide resources and education that we supply through other organizations and to people directly to help them. I will teach and speak in person because I like to, but mostly we're trying to capture, online courses, online education, videos. We have two blogs. We're on social media, we're on YouTube. So mostly we're trying to supply resources because, I the part about ministry I felt is I wanted it to be multipliable, right? There's nothing wrong with serving people one at a time, right? Very often that's how it happened. And but I also wanted to do things that could be multiplied because when you study things like addiction and mental health issues, guess what? 90% of people who struggle with them aren't getting help. They're just toughing it out. And maybe they figure it out on their own. It's possible. It's hard, but it's possible. Or maybe they just grit their teeth and through sheer willpower get through and stop their bad habit. Or maybe they live with it and affects them and the people they love for the rest of their lives, and maybe they die. You know, addiction is a compulsive disease that's progressive. And it may take 40 years to kill someone, but it's it's going to get you. And by killing them, I mean sometimes literally, but also emotionally and spiritually. When I say literally, meaning I've been to the funeral of my wife's best friend. I've my son was the pallbearer of his best friend, and he's been to three funerals. I I meet parents all the time who've lost a son. So,
Uh,
and right now the number one cause of death in the United States, starting at age 18, is fentanyl. It's one drug is the number one cause of death at age. So, a lot of people die, but
right.
a lot of people just live lives of quiet desperation. Repeating a habit which they think will make things feel better for a while, which ultimately makes it worse.
Hmm.
So sorry I get carried away, but so we provide online and digital resources and education to help people. We supply it through organizations, churches, schools, other nonprofits, but also directly to individuals. If anybody goes to lifeimprovementsteps.com, up at the top, they can see, hey, there's these free toolkits I can choose, and there's one called Proactive Parenting, right? So you can go to lifeimprovementsteps.com and click on Proactive Parenting and go, oh, wow, okay. Here's a short, easy to use course on raising teenagers, or biblical parenting, or parenting in a crisis, or grandparenting, or parenting kids.
Yeah.
So that's what we're trying to do, Roy, is actually make the ministry multipliable. Yesterday I met with a foster parenting organization who's using our resources because foster parents are often picking up kids who have a trauma affected background,
Sure.
so they're using it with those. We met with the officials of DHR, right, which is Department of Human Resources, who deal with, so helping parents or caregivers is a primary part of what we do. We have a curriculum for teenagers themselves. It's being taught in an inner city high school now, and we're piloting it, and we'll make that available for teenagers themselves. It's originally an in-person curriculum that can be taught in small groups or a class, but we have online material for individuals, who are dealing with anxiety or any, early indication of mental health or substance abuse, but also just things about how do you live intentionally? How do you be more productive in life? How do you have good relationships? Because all of those are part of us, right? We are
Right.
designed as holistic beings, right? God said we're supposed to love Him with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, right? So what we create tries to address our holistic well-being, which we would say is spiritual, social, mental, emotional, and personal, our will. So online resources is our primary go-to way to help people.
Love it. Absolutely love it. I thank
Right.
you for explaining it the way you did. And please don't apologize for telling a story in the middle of it. That's what makes somebody want to
Yeah.
go look it up. So
Yeah. Well, I
I
get
think
I,
it's
I get
great.
excited about stuff, so I get carried away.
No, it's contagious.
So,
I appreciate
yeah.
your passion
Yeah.
for everything you're doing. The
Yeah.
here in our program and in our private groups and in our coaching that we do, one of the things that we talk about all the time is that the three main roles of a father and husband is to protect, provide, and lead. And the
Yeah.
one that gets left behind so often is leading.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
one thing that is very, very clear from this
Yeah.
conversation is um, you've done a very good job of leading your family through your recovery and theirs, and kudos to you, my friend, because you have
Yeah.
done a lot of this and been the
Yeah.
catalyst for a lot of it.
Yeah. I'll tell one last anecdote about our other son, who because he doesn't come up in the story very much because I'll be darned if he was at age 14 and still is one of the wisest people I've ever met. I don't know where he got it from, but when he came to faith in the sixth grade youth group, and it's very sincere faith, and he just makes good decisions. I'll be darned. He's a very wise young man. But when he was a kid, my wife and I sat him down one time and said, a lot's been going on around you, and my wife and I had probably stabilized by then. We were doing okay, but his older brother was acting out. So we said, have you felt, how has that affected you? In what way? And he sat there and thought about it for a while. And I think he was like 11 or 12 or something. And the answer he gave back, he says, well, what I've learned is that people will often make mistakes. And sometimes those mistakes will create bad things that happen, but that they can get through them, and that they can go on and learn that, and that they need other people's support to do that. I'm going, I'm going, wow, I know a lot of 65-year-old people who need to know that. So I don't know. But like I said, we're very open in our parenting material. I use mistakes that we made as examples because it's all good, right? We use our life as a ministry. Yeah,
Well, I think you just proved my point about you leading your family. If your youngest is coming
yeah,
off like that, that's
yeah.
he's getting it from someplace, Daddy.
It's
So,
that's a credit to him.
way to
And
go.
yeah,
That's awesome. Um,
and I don't get to talk about him, so I'll give one more short story.
Go
This
for it.
this is very short. If you're going to pick something as a dad that is like one of those moments where I'm going, man, this is about as good as it gets. When he was, I'm not sure how old he was. I'll say he was 16 or 17. He went with me to a Promise Keepers event.
Oh, wow.
The program had evolved since then, and when I went, it was in football stadiums.
Right.
It went to a point where it was in like basketball arenas. It was down to a point where it was in conference rooms. So we went to a place in Nashville. There were like 5,000 people there, all men. And I'm sitting there at a Promise Keepers event with my son. I'm going, this works, So that was pretty cool, you know.
That's amazing. And
Yeah,
congrats,
yeah,
because that's a memory that's a
yeah,
bucket list
yeah,
memory right there. That's bucket
yeah.
list.
That's a good one.
um, Steve, I can't thank you enough for everything you've done here today and what you've shared with everybody. And I know you're connecting with people who are listening to this right now. I would be remiss, though, to think that we've covered everything, because you've unpacked so much and you've got a lot to offer and you're also doing a lot. So let me throw it to you as we kind of close things out here. And I want to give you the floor, for a moment or two. Is there anything I didn't ask you about? Anything that maybe we did talk about, but you want to drive home, a little stronger, or even just a leave behind, something that you want to leave for everybody to contemplate or advice or something? The floor is yours for a couple minutes, my friend. What have you got for us?
The leave behind for me is that everybody needs to recognize that we've all got stuff going on. You know, one half of nuclear families have substance abuse and mental health. One half of families. Okay. But if you expand that to include anxiety and depression and loneliness and frustration and loss of hope and job meaningless, we've all got stuff going on, everybody. So for the people who are listening, they're hurting, right? Some of them are living lives of quiet frustration. And if they happen to be in a period where everything is going well, someone, in fact, multiple someones close to them are hurting. So the thing I would say is, it's okay not to be okay, but you don't have to stay that way. In other words, don't let the shame of how you feel make you feel like, well, this is just me. I'm the only one going through this and I can't talk to anybody about it. I just have to struggle through it on my own. Don't do that. It's okay that you have something going on because we all do. But your friends and buddies and people at church and at work, they're just not talking about it, but they do too. So it's okay, but talk to somebody about it, take steps. Even if it has to be confidentially, you know, on your laptop or phone, go somewhere, go to lifeimprovementsteps.com, take some positive steps. And what you'll see is you'll go, well, I'll be darned, feel a little bit better by taking those steps. Maybe I should keep moving in that direction. And then hopefully, if you've really been struggling, get some help. Recovery is an awesome experience. I love it. I love going to recovery meetings still. But whether it's a counselor or seeing a pastor or just working through it with your spouse or a really close friend, don't suffer in silence and just carry that pain with you on your own. And if you're naive or in denial, just understand that there might be some things that you don't know that you don't know. So pause and think about what's going on. Think about what's really important in life. Don't struggle through it on your own. Reach out and get some help and take it a step at a time from there. So, and things can get better. They really can. I'll close with this. STEPS tries to provide help, healing, and hope to hurting people. Help is practical steps to get better. Healing is encouragement for the hurting. Hope, I'll use this term, a practical assurance of a positive future. Now, how could I give a practical assurance of a positive future? And there's three reasons. One, because no matter what your listeners are going through, a lot of other people have been there too. They have, and they've gotten better. So it's possible. It can happen. The second is there are positive steps you can take that will make you feel better. They won't fix your problems overnight. There's no magic wand, but there are steps you can take so that you'll feel better. And the third is that there is an all powerful God who loves you very much, and he will be with you every step of the way. So you can have a positive assurance of a good future. It may not seem like it at times, but it's true.
What a great way to wrap this up. Steve, thank you so much for that
My
and for
pleasure.
everything you brought to the podcast today. It really meant a lot, brother. Thank you very much.
Good. Thank you very much. Roy, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Folks, I was going to wrap this up a whole different way until that closeout. And now I'm just going to go ahead and drive home something Steve just said. And that is, you're not alone. We talk about that a lot in this podcast. And for me, that was standing out really hard when I was listening to Steve close out. Folks, you have value. The reason that we do this, the reason we bring on powerful men talking about powerful topics is because you are worth it and you have value. And we do this for you. And finally, we do it so that you will know that no matter what it is you're going through, you're never alone. You just have to believe it. Until next time.